Hi, yes, I'm Florence. Sorry, it was already on the screen. I'm a planning archaeologist working in London, but in my spare time, I do research into archaeology and video games. So I'm an Archaea gamer, and yes, today I'm going to be talking about maps in video games. So, what are maps? They can be defined as kind of a non-human object that provides testimony in a visual form. And maps are something that we use day to day, whether digital or not. So how many people here used Google Maps to navigate their way to the conference today? Yeah, that's what I thought. A lot of hands just went up, and that includes me as well. So, you know, as something that we kind of just use without thinking, potentially, it's an everyday occurrence. Maps can seem sort of almost invisible in our lives or neutral, and that's something I really wanted to question and look into in terms of video games, especially because they're so prevalent in them as well. And in particular, I wanted to look at how archaeogamers, people who study archaeology and video games, study maps and produce them themselves. So in terms of the field of archaeology itself, how have archaeologists kind of approached maps and theorized them? There is a very kind of colonial history to maps. For example, Thomas Gover has talked about how the earliest Ordnance Survey maps in the United Kingdom were basically produced as a means of kind of documenting control over certain areas, such as Ireland at the time. And Christopher Tilley, who's known for talking about landscape and archaeology, has really kind of critiqued the use of maps and other representations to study archaeology, and basically says you can't really get a proper sense of that landscape without being there yourself. But reading further into this, I found an article by Gillings et al., which I found really useful because basically they kind of pose the point that to say that maps are essentially colonialist or essentially sexist, for example, or essentially presented as objective isn't fair. Actually, maps aren't necessarily those things. It depends on how we make them and how we use them. And that kind of leads into my next point, which is that maps can be seen as assemblages. This is something that Aldred and Lucas argue. They're made up of different interpretations themselves, and also they're very contingent on the context in which they're used. So, on to archaeogaming. What is archaeogaming? So, just in case you haven't really come across this before, archaeogaming can kind of be summarized as the study of video games as artifacts, as immaterial spaces, and as programming. And I decided to include this slide from another presentation that I did because I realized, oh, I've kind of already created a mind map about archaeogaming. You know, we create maps of ourselves all the time as academics to try and kind of disseminate information, to try and figure out things ourselves. So you can kind of theorize that archaeogaming is about praxis. So we've got Andrew Reinhardt, who we had earlier with his video about the No Man's Sky archaeological survey. He considers video games as archaeological sites in of themselves. We've also got Megan Dennis, who's done work into the ethics of how archaeology is represented in video games. And also Tara Copplestone, who's kind of explored non-linear narrative through creating video games herself. And so, in terms of the field of archaeogaming, the reason why I want to specifically look at the kind of maps that archaeogamers produce themselves is because I believe that's a really good way of understanding where we are at with the discipline and what we're doing. There was a quote from the Lucas and Aldred article that I mentioned earlier, where they talk about how maps make things that are near distant. They provide distance. We're able to see things that are normally at a scale that we normally wouldn't be able to see. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to see archaeogaming itself at a distance through looking at archaeogaming maps. But it's also kind of good to mention the kind of maps that we get in video games themselves. probably something which would kind of first easily come to mind is the sort of maps that you get in strategy games such as Age of Empires, which I've got on the screen here, in which sort of the game space itself is like a map, and that it's kind of a top-down approach. And it's sort of interesting talking about this theme of colonialism and maps, a game called literally Age of Empires, that, is very much kind of map-based. It's interesting, we've got that really strong, connection there, even in video games, or perhaps, of course, in video games. But also you get other games in which the game space is the map, which you may not have really thought about it in that way before. So like Pac-Man, basically, yeah, the game is a map. And the game map doesn't change throughout the levels, just the speed changes. But an interesting thing that you can kind of think about with Pac-Man is that actually, in some ways, it's a very dynamic map, because as the ghosts kind of move around, they form dead ends, which means that changes where you can go. And also, kind of another point that I really wanted to make about video game maps is that they're sort of present throughout the life cycle of a game, if you want to look at it in that way, because game developers create maps themselves to try and work out what the game space is going to look like. And then, we have different forms of maps in games, especially in big open world games, because we need them as a player, otherwise we're going to get lost. But also, players create their own maps, whether as fans or to help each other, and also you get kind of game manuals, which are, again, about helping people navigate game spaces. So the first example of kind of a map made by an Archaea gamer is one of my own. I thought it was only fair to critique one of my own maps if I was going to do this. So in a presentation I did last month, I focused on a game called Nier Automata, in which the premise is that you play as an android kind of many years in the future in this proxy war between robots and androids. One feature of the game is that if you're kind of in the network mode, if you've got that switched on, then you can see where other players have died. Their bodies appear on the game map. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try and create this map of where players have died as sort of this kind of digital mortuary archaeology. To be honest, in the end, I was very kind of dissatisfied personally with what I produced, because it seemed to me, in a way, quite simplistic. I mean, you can see on screen, I had to include screenshots because really otherwise you've got no context, no idea of what I was actually depicting. It's just dots on the screen. But I think I was really kind of, because I didn't have the confidence to kind of go further, I was really kind of leaning into things that I was used to doing in my day job as an archaeologist. So using software like ArcGIS, where, yeah, essentially a lot of the time you're putting dots on a map, and actually it made me start to question, well, what is that actually representing? What does that actually show? My next example you will be familiar with now, because Andrew was just talking about this earlier, the No Man's Sky Archaeological Survey. So I kind of took a couple of examples from his blog online, including one which I found really interesting, which is kind of his own personal kind of pen and paper maps that he created as kind of like a first step. He kind of describes this as helping him understand the space. And so it's interesting in that, kind of considering that different types of maps almost have different textures in of themselves, and that they kind of work together to help, the archaeologists gain an understanding of the space that they're studying. One thing that I'd really been kind of thinking about for a while is this idea that potentially you can see No Man's Sky as kind of having colonial undertones, as a game that's very much about kind of going to planets, essentially naming them, potentially kind of exploiting the resources there. I thought that was kind of an interesting topic, so I brought that up with Andrew, and he kind of very helpfully has written a blog post about that subject. You can see the link down at the bottom there below, where he kind of explores this further. So do check that out and have a look at it. So the final case study I want to look at is, again, kind of returning to the idea of a mind map being a form of map. And this example was created by Brielle Murray Tetlock, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in which they kind of did a sort of semantic mapping of different terms in relation to Archaea Gaming and the practice of Archaea Gaming. It's this really great giant mind map, so I can only include like certain portions of it. And you can see there's an index there, which is color-coded to show the different sources that they used to construct it. Including, for example, Queer Game Studies, the book. And in particular, they've got they kind of look at how, where is archaeogaming situated? It's simultaneously within kind of meat space, the kind of analog world and the digital world at the same time. And we kind of need to consider that in our studies. And that's kind of a point that I really want to link into my conclusion. So I've got a GIF here of from Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, which I really like, because basically, again, it's this idea that the game world is a map. You can see in the GIF, like, I've sailed to the edge of the map and that's it. I can't go any further. And in fact, even you're told as a player to kind of dissuade you from keep doing it. Oh, it's dangerous. You can't go any further. So it's this idea that going off the map is dangerous. But I think that actually, as kind of scholars, as archaeogamers, it's really interesting to play around with this idea of maps as assemblages, not just within themselves, but between them. I think it's kind of productive to look at lots of different maps in tandem, and actually we need different forms of mapping. We need to record space through kind of traditional means, digital means, but also through, for example, as kind of Andrew showed before, through video capture and other things like that. And also kind of referencing Sara Ahmed's queer phenomenology, in which she kind of talks about how it's in the moments of disorientation that we really think about what it means to be oriented. So it's kind of the points in games where we do feel lost, or there is that sense of, oh, don't go any further, this is it. That's when we start to really question how are we navigating the world and what does that actually mean. Thank you very much.
Any questions from Florence? Let me see where that, yes, there we go. You've got a laptop on your lap, I'm just gonna bring it over to you. Oh, okay.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have a question that I've been struggling a lot with also in my own work on maps and games and everything in between. When does so it's a question of language to some extent, right? So I would argue that the last map, the mind map, is not a map because it lacks the kind of the spatial fixation of a cartographic map to some extent. And so how would you, I don't have a question, I would just like to hear your thoughts about it. Where does the kind of the graphical form overflow from the mappiness, and what is it about the maps in games, especially games being a spatial medium, that makes them so interesting in your work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was really thinking about that, the last example. I mean, yeah, where do you kind of draw the line with maps? I'm not sure I really have an exact answer to that, but in terms of the last example I used, the reason why I think you can think of that as a map is because in a way that kind of shows the space between ideas. I think that's kind of what that map was showing in a way. But yes, I think the reason why game maps are so compelling is because games are, especially, for example, big open world games, there are these fantastically extensive game spaces, and to have a representation of that, is, I think, something that's very attractive in general for game players. I mean, for example, you get people who, buy posters of maps of their favorite games and things like that. So there's that kind of, that strong sense of identity, I think, with maps. Yeah. I'm not sure if that was an answer, but...
Yep, you get to throw it now there. Very well done. Should I try to throw it, or well, I'll just. All right, I'll try to throw it. Whoops. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I find it interesting that when I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about the different kinds of maps I've encountered in games, and we see obviously Pac-Man is a nice example where the whole thing is there and there's nothing more to find. Although it doesn't work like the real world because you can go off one side and come on the other, which is a very interesting thing. And then you have maps where you have kind of this fog of war effect that it fills in as you explore. But in reference to kind of some of the stuff that was talked about earlier, in Firewatch, you see the whole map to begin with, and as you play through the game, notes are added, which gives that map a very different feel. Are there other things that happen like that in games, do you know of? As a creator, I look at that and I kind of, listening to you speak, I'm hearing ideas coming out of like, how would I create a map which tracks the player, and what would that mean?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I can't off the top of my head think of something exactly like Firewatch, but yeah, that was an example that I wish I'd had time to look at, because I think it's also a really interesting example of, as I remember it, you can kind of quite easily sort of have it in your hand as you're moving around and looking at things. I really like that, that sense of you're really interacting with the environment whilst looking at it. And then, yeah, the idea that as you progress, or well, as you kind of explore more areas, you can see, yeah, that you're putting marks on the map. And I guess, yeah, that does feel more personal and perhaps potentially more meaningful to the player, because it kind of correlates with their own journey. And yeah, I'd be really interested to see different ways of experimenting with that, and maybe more kind of, you know, freedom for the player to be more creative with that, if that were possible. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I know, I'd never thought about it before, but in lots of video games, you take stuff off maps. You're ticking off boxes and removing it, and that's a case where you're actually adding stuff. And I can't think of that happening anywhere else. It's interesting. Thank you for your talk. Very, very, very thought-provoking. Yeah.
You can actually throw it right over there. Yeah.
Yeah, just on that. Anybody who's played the Breath of the Wild game might know that the map is quite customizable, and it does get revealed in sections as you achieve certain goals. But then there are symbols you can apply to the map, and it doesn't tell you necessarily what they mean. So you can choose to indicate, you know, an enemy or a resource or something with whatever picture you want. And I think you can use up to 100 of them, and you can put them anywhere. And the other thing I noticed, and this is only at a late stage, was what you just referred to in Firewatch, is that the labels of places are only added when you reach them, although the overall shape of the map can be quite quickly discovered. So relatively late in the game, you can still find a new place and add a little annotation by just visiting it. So in a sense, it's constantly evolving until it's completely full. But I just had a quick question about, if there's time, about whether you think a map should always be about, you know, in a game we assume that there is a perfect form of the map that you're aiming towards. Do you think there could be a game where you, apart from procedurally generated ones, where you genuinely interact with the map and every player has a different appearance, look to the game? Because topography doesn't map onto a real relation between spaces. Usually you're hopping between them. Very few of them are totally seamless. I'm just wondering, you could put, maybe what I'm explaining isn't very clear. I could try to explain it later. What I mean is, say you've got points on a map. Those could be in any particular configuration you like. So you could shape the map in a way you could never do in other media.
Yeah, again, that's another really interesting idea. I think, from what I remember, this is kind of sort of related, Andrew's kind of mapped his movements through, I think it was Skyrim, and kind of did a map of that. But yeah, as a player, being able to kind of look back on the kind of paths that you've taken, yeah, again, I think that would be really interesting. And to be able to compare between different players, how they've approached different levels of a game. Because even just, you know, playing a game like, you know, Legend of Zelda with my friend the other day, I noticed she did things completely differently, you know, approached things in a way that I didn't. So to be able to kind of visualize that with a map, yeah.
Thank you.